She hadn't cried in 6 years, until that night in a town where cruelty was the law. A silent woman, broken but unbowed, meets a scarred man who shows her a different kind of strength. What happens next will shatter everything they thought they knew about pain and trust. Tell us where you're watching from in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe if you love stories that hit deep. Now, stay with us. This is one you can't miss. They never tell you how silence can scream, how it can echo louder than gunshots, sharper than a broken bottle pressed against your throat. I learned that the first time I bled for someone else's amusement, and again every time after. The town didn't even have a name worth carving on a grave. Just wind-burned shacks and a crooked sign nailed into a leaning post. Dust so thick it tasted like old bones. And me, barefoot, bruised, and burned by memory more than sun. I'd stopped counting the years since I last called somewhere home, or since I let someone call me anything gentler than what I'd come to expect, which, stray, trouble. Once, a man called me pretty, before his hand closed round my throat. Pretty doesn't mean safe. It never did. The day I limped into this town, my lip was split from the night before, and my ribs ached so deep I tasted iron every time I breathed. But hunger is louder than pain. And hope, God, that rotten, stubborn weed, still grew in the cracks of me, whispering maybe this place would be different. Maybe someone would see me and not see something to break. They saw me, all right. Saw the torn dress, the dirt in my hair, the limp in my step, and turned away. Mothers dragged children off the street like my shadow could stain them. Men laughed behind swinging saloon doors, voices slurred and sharp. I kept my eyes on the ground, trying to look small, invisible. Funny thing about invisibility, it only works until someone wants to look. By sundown, my stomach gnawed itself raw. I asked for work at the livery, the general store, even offered to scrub floors at the saloon. They laughed, told me to come back after dark, with a wink that made my skin crawl. I left before the wink turned to a grip. I found water in a trough by the road, rusty and warm under the dying sun. I drank anyway, because thirst doesn't care about taste. My reflection in the ripples looked older than I remembered, the bruise on my cheek already blooming purple. That's when they came. 3 of them. Loud with cheap whiskey, and mean with the kind of emptiness that needs to fill itself by emptying someone else. They didn't want my words, just my fear. And my silence gave them that in spades. I didn't scream when they shoved me behind the saloon. Didn't beg when the first fist knocked the wind out of me. You'd think that would make them stop. It didn't. Pain is familiar. It doesn't surprise me anymore. What surprised me was what came after. Because when they'd had enough of my silence, enough of proving to each other they still had power, they left me in the dirt beside a cracked barrel. I lay there staring at the sky, ribs on fire, cheek bleeding into the dust. The sky didn't care either. The world felt so big and so empty all at once. I'd felt that before. It used to scare me. Now, it just felt true. Somewhere, a door slammed. Boots scuffed gravel. But no one came closer. No one offered help. I don't know how long I lay there before I made myself get up. My legs shook. Every breath stabbed like a knife under my ribs. But I stood, because lying down means dying. And I wasn't ready. That's when I saw him. At first, just a shape in the dusk. Wide-brim hat pulled low, a coat hanging heavy off his shoulders. He didn't swagger like the others. Didn't smirk. Just stood there, shadow long on the dirt. Watching. I wanted to run. But my legs wouldn't. Fear can make you move. But sometimes, it freezes you instead. Then he stepped closer, slow as dusk creeping over fields. In his hand, a dented tin cup. Steam curled from it, soft as breath on glass. I thought it was a trick. I've known too many men who give first to take more after. But his eyes didn't leer, didn't dance with cruelty or hunger. They were quiet eyes, and tired. He set the cup near me, not forcing it into my hands, stepped back. His voice, when it came, was low, careful, like it hadn't been used in a while. "Drink. You're safe now." Safe. The word tasted strange, like honey on a tongue that only knew salt. I didn't answer, just stared at the cup, steam catching in the cold air. My hands shook when I reached for it. The warmth seeped into my bones faster than the broth itself. He watched, but not like the others. Not waiting for something to happen. Just making sure it did. Then he laid his coat on the ground beside me. Not on me, not draped over my shoulders like a claim. Just near enough that I could choose. And then he turned, started to walk away. For a moment, the words stuck in my throat. Then I rasped out, voice raw as old rope. "Why?" He paused. Didn't turn, but his head dipped. Like he was remembering the answer, not making it up. Because someone should. He kept walking, slow and steady, toward the edge of town where the land rose into black hills. And I sat there, bruised, bleeding, heart thundering in my chest louder than the silence around me. I could have gone south, kept running. But my feet stayed. My fear stayed. And something else, too, small and stubborn, buried deep. I picked up his coat, wrapped it around my shoulders. Smelled dust, leather, and something warm underneath. And then I followed. The coat felt heavier than it looked. Not just leather and dust, but the weight of something I couldn't name. It smelled of rain that had dried long ago, wood smoke, and something faintly sharp, like iron, maybe blood, maybe memory. I trailed after him, limping through dust and brittle sagebrush that scratched at my ankles. The town shrank behind me, its crooked roofs and darker corners fading into a bruise of dusk. Ahead, the land opened wide, empty in a way that wasn't cruel, just honest. He didn't look back. Didn't hurry either. His steps measured, quiet, as though he walked this path every night and knew it by heart. The sky bruised deeper into purple and ash. Coyotes called somewhere far off, their voices thin and lonely. My breath rasped in my chest, each inhale scraping against cracked ribs. But I kept moving. The choice felt less like my own and more like something older pulling at my bones. At last, the ground sloped into a shallow hollow where a cabin crouched between twisted pines. Weather-worn boards patched with care, not pride. Smoke curled from the chimney, thin and patient. Light spilled soft through a single window, gold against the dark. He stepped onto the porch, boots creaking against the boards, and turned. For the first time, our eyes met clear in the lamplight. His were grey or green, or both, shadowed but steady. I braced for hunger, for expectation. Instead, I found only watching, noticing. He opened the door without a word, pushing it wide so I could see inside before stepping through. The room smelled of cedar smoke and something simmering slow. Onions, beans, something simple. The walls were rough-hewn logs, worn smooth in places by use, not polish. A single rocking chair swayed slightly, as if just left. I hesitated at the threshold. A dozen nights flashed behind my eyes, rooms where warmth turned to trap, where kindness lasted only until the door latched shut. My fingers clenched in his coat, nails biting through cloth. Then I noticed the door. He'd left it wide open, and still stood aside, waiting. My legs shook as I stepped over the threshold. The fire in the hearth breathed orange across the floorboards, softening shadows into something almost gentle. He walked in after me, quiet as dusk itself, and set a dented tin bowl on a low table. No welcome, no question, just space offered, not claimed. I stayed near the door, shoulder pressed against the cold wood, ready to bolt if the air shifted wrong. He moved about the room without looking at me, hanging his coat on a peg, stirring the pot hanging over the coals. His silence wasn't heavy. It felt like a blanket laid near, not over. When he ladled stew into the bowl, the smell hit me so hard my mouth watered painfully. My legs moved before my mind decided, drawn by hunger older than fear. I sat on the edge of a bench, ready to spring back. My hands shook as I lifted the spoon. The first bite scalded my tongue, but the pain felt honest. Salt, thyme, something rough but nourishing. Food meant fulfilling, not impressing. My ribs ached when I swallowed, but the warmth spread slow and stubborn through my chest. He didn't watch me eat. Instead, he knelt by the hearth, adding a log to the fire, fingers careful not to scatter embers. His presence filled the cabin, but never pressed close. I kept waiting for the question, for the price, for the hand reaching across the table. But none came. After the bowl was empty, he cleared it without a word, set a battered tin mug of tea before me. Weak and bitter, but hot. I wrapped my hands around the cup, feeling heat seep into my bones. I hadn't realized how cold I'd been until then. Silence stretched between us, not sharp, not awkward, just there. At last, he spoke, voice low and rough like boots over gravel. "My name's Ransom." That was all. No question back. No demand. Just a name offered into the quiet. I didn't give mine. Not then. My name had been used against me too many times, twisted on too many tongues. But I tasted it at the back of my throat, remembering how it used to sound when someone kind said it. The fire popped. Shadows danced on the walls, softening the scar that carved across his jaw from ear to chin. Pale against sun-dark skin, it looked like a story no one dared to ask about. He unrolled a blanket near the hearth, not telling me to lie down, just setting it there. Then he stepped back, picked up an old book from the shelf, and sat in the rocking chair, turning pages without glancing my way. I stood by the door so long my knees ached. Breath caught tight in my chest, heart drumming loud enough I feared he'd hear. But nothing happened. The chair creaked slow, the fire crackled, and outside, wind stirred the pines. At last, my body folded, exhaustion heavier than fear. I sank onto the blanket, curling tight, coat still wrapped round me. The floorboards held my weight without protest. The fire kept burning. The door stayed unlocked. My eyes burned with unshed tears, but none fell. Not yet. Sleep didn't come soft. I woke at every shift of shadow, every crack of the fire. But each time, I saw him still in the chair, eyes half-lidded, book forgotten in his lap. Guarding, but not caging. In the deepest hour of night, when fear rose like tide, I whispered my name into the dark. Unia. He didn't stir. But something in his face eased, the corner of his mouth softening as if in sleep he'd heard and understood. For the first time in years, I drifted into sleep not from exhaustion, but because the world outside my eyelids felt less sharp. Dreams came, but not of fists. I dreamed of running barefoot over fields at dawn, of rain softening dust, of violets blooming where none should grow. And in every dream, I wasn't alone. Morning found me curled on my side, the blanket pulled higher over my shoulder than I remembered. Fire still burned low, embers stubborn as weeds. Through the window, I saw him splitting wood, axe rising and falling in slow rhythm, muscles working under rolled sleeves. No rush, no show, just work. Something in my chest ached, not fear, not hunger, something nameless, older than pain. I rose slow, body stiff, bruises singing under my skin. At the sideboard, a basin of water waited, clean, a folded cloth beside it, and a small tin of soap, half used. My throat closed. Such a small kindness, but it hit harder than any blow. I washed, flinching at the sting on split skin. Watched the water darken with dirt and old blood. When I lifted my head, my reflection in the basin looked less like prey. I stepped outside barefoot still, the coat heavy around my shoulders. He paused, axe across his shoulder, and nodded once. "Morning," he said, voice soft as smoke. I nodded back, words stuck behind my teeth. He offered an apple, peeled, cut in quarters. I took it without our fingers brushing, sat on the porch step and ate, chewing slow, letting sweetness mix with salt from a split lip. The morning felt wide, open, but not empty. Somewhere behind my ribs, something small dared to hope. They say trust is earned, but for some of us, it's closer to remembered, like an old tune half forgotten until someone hums the first note. That morning on the porch, apple sweet on my tongue, sun spilling over frost-hardened ground, I felt the first thread of it tug at me. Thin, trembling, but real. He didn't ask where I'd come from. Didn't ask what had put bruises on my skin or shadows behind my eyes. The questions hung between us like unpicked fruit, and strangely, that felt kinder than asking. Instead, he offered something else. Work. His voice stayed low, almost careful, as if words themselves might bruise me. Could use help with the well. If you're steady. I wasn't. My ribs still ached sharp with every breath, and my palms shook when I reached for the bucket rope. But the simple shape of the task, the way it began and ended, felt safer than thinking. I lowered the bucket, hand over hand, splinters biting into old scars. Drew it up slow, muscles burning with effort that hurt clean instead of dirty. Spilled the water into a trough, watched it catch morning light in silver ripples. He worked beside me, chopping wood into neat piles, stacking them against the shed wall. Not speaking unless he needed to, not filling silence with noise. The quiet felt strange at first, too big, but slowly it wrapped itself around me soft as dusk. Once, our eyes met across the yard. His gaze didn't flinch from my bruises, didn't linger like a brand. It just was. Seeing, not measuring. Later, he brought out an old pair of boots. Scuffed leather, too large, but the soles still held. He didn't say why. Just set them on the porch beside me. I slipped them on, toes grateful for the borrowed shield. We ate midday meal on the porch. Bread, beans cooked soft, a cup of water cool from the well. My hunger roared, but I forced slow bites, tongue still learning to trust food offered without a price. "Where were you heading?" he asked then, almost like he couldn't keep the question caged any longer. My words came slow, hoarse from disuse. "Anywhere folks ain't cruel." His mouth twitched, not quite a smile. "Harder to find than you hope," he said, voice low enough to sound like he spoke more to himself than to me. I swallowed, looked down at my scabbed hands. "You think this place is different?" "No," he answered simply. "Just quieter." Something in that honesty settled the air between us. Quieter wasn't safe, but it was better than nothing. That afternoon, I swept the porch, gathered kindling, kept my hands busy so my mind wouldn't wander to alleyways and fists. Pain stitched itself into my muscles, but it felt earned, not given. Inside the cabin, he kept his things simple. A table scarred by years, shelves of jars, beans, flour, herbs dried and hanging in bunches. A single blanket folded on a narrow bed he didn't offer. Instead, he laid mine near the hearth again at sundown. No words. Just a gesture, quiet and sure. That night, the fire burned lower, shadows stretching long across the floorboards. I lay awake, staring at ceiling beams darkened by decades of smoke. My mind wandered, unwelcome, back to men whose laughter turned mean, to cold nights curled under eaves with hunger gnawing bone. Shame burned hotter than any ember, remembering how easily fear had taught me to flinch. But here, flinching felt pointless. He didn't reach, didn't test the boundaries I'd drawn tight around myself. His silence wasn't absence. It felt like space made, patiently waiting for something to grow. Once, I cracked an eye open to see him sketching by firelight. A scrap of paper balanced on one knee, pencil moving slow. "What do you draw?" I asked, voice raw from hours of quiet. He didn't look up. "Whatever stays in my mind." He turned the page so I could see. A horse mid-stride, neck arched. Rough lines, but alive somehow. "Your horse was," he said, soft. "Lost him years back. I didn't ask how." The way his mouth tightened at the corner told enough. The fire cracked, spitting a spark that died before it landed. Silence returned, but softer this time. Morning came, and with it frost silvering the grass. My breath fogged the air as I stepped outside, boots heavy on my feet, coat wrapped tight around my ribs. Ransom was already splitting wood, steady rhythm slow as a prayer. Axe rising, falling, chips of pine scattering around his boots. His strength wasn't loud. It lived in the quiet patience of each swing. I found myself watching longer than I meant to, drawn not by the muscle or motion, but by the way he moved, like someone who knew violence but chose not to wear it. When he noticed my gaze, he paused, nodded once, and offered a peeled apple again. I sat on the porch step, would cool under me, eating in slow bites while morning stretched pale across the hills. The wind smelled of thawing earth, the promise of green hidden beneath frost. A thought stirred, so small it felt dangerous. Maybe tomorrow wouldn't hurt quite so much. Nights were still the hardest. By daylight, I could keep my hands busy, hauling water, sweeping the porch, mending torn seams in the coat he'd lent me. Movement dulled memory's teeth. The small sounds of morning, firewood crackling, boots crunching frost, the creak of his chair, wove into something like comfort. But when darkness settled thick over the hills, old ghosts stirred. That night, I woke choking on my breath, sweat cold down my back, ribs aching from the force of a silent scream. In the dream, they'd found me again. Men whose laughter curved sharp as knives, whose hands gripped hard enough to bruise soul as well as skin. For a moment, I forgot where I was. My body curled tight, heart a wild drum in my chest. The cabin felt too small, shadows too deep. Then I heard it. Not words, just the low, steady scrape of pencil on paper. A sound so gentle it shouldn't have been enough, but somehow it was. I opened my eyes. The fire burned low, but still alive. Beside it, Ransom sat hunched over a scrap of paper, pencil moving in careful lines. His face half lit by emberlight, the scar on his jaw pale against the shadows. He didn't look up, didn't speak, but his presence filled the room in a way that didn't press, like a wall built not to trap, but to shelter. My breath slowed, each inhale catching less painfully. I uncurled, legs shaking, the blanket twisted around my ankles. "You awake?" My voice rasped, small and hoarse. "I am," he answered softly, pencil still moving. That was all. No questions. No pity. Silence stretched, but it didn't choke me this time. "What are you drawing?" I asked, words sticking like burrs on my tongue. His pencil paused. For a heartbeat, he seemed to consider not showing me. Then he turned the paper around. It wasn't a horse this time. It was me. Not the broken thing I saw in the basin each morning, all hollows and bruises. In his lines I was bent, but not crushed, sitting near the hearth, eyes turned toward the fire, hands wrapped around a cup. The tilt of my shoulders spoke of weariness, but also of something stubborn, refusing to bow completely. My breath caught, chest tight with something that wasn't fear. "Why draw me?" I managed. His gaze met mine then, steady and unhurried. "To remember," he said. "Remember what?" "That some things break, but don't stay broken." The fire cracked, sending a flare of orange across the floorboards. I looked away first, throat tight. No one had ever drawn me before, let alone seen anything worth remembering. He set the paper aside, the pencil rolling a little before settling. I lay back down, blanket pulled to my chin, heart still too loud in my ears. But the panic had ebbed, leaving something quieter behind. In the half-light, I let my eyes drift over him, the slope of his shoulders, the worn cuffs of his shirt, the slow rise and fall of his chest as he breathed. The scar on his jaw didn't look cruel in the firelight. It looked honest. "Ransom," I whispered. His name felt heavy on my tongue, but right somehow. He turned his head slightly, not quite looking at me. "Thank you," I said, voice cracking on the last syllable. He didn't say anything back, but his hand moved, almost unconsciously, closer to the fire, closer to where I lay, without crossing the space between. Just enough so I'd know I wasn't alone. I slept again, this time without dreams sharp enough to cut. Morning came, pale and cold, the sky the color of hammered tin. I rose slow, bruises stiff but fading from purple to yellow. Outside, frost limbed every blade of grass, turning the yard into a field of glass needles. Ransom was already up, his coat dusted with frost, breath a white plume in the air. He nodded at me, eyes flicking briefly to my face, as if checking I'd slept, but too careful to ask outright. I found the basin still clean, fresh water poured for washing. Beside it, the folded cloth, and next to that, the sketch from the night before. I traced the lines with my fingertip, careful not to smudge them. Something in my chest twisted, painful but not cruel. At the door, he waited, an apple in hand. His way of saying morning without words. I took it, our fingers brushing this time. Only for a breath, but it felt like lightning under my skin. He didn't pull back fast, didn't freeze. Just let it happen, like it was nothing to be feared. We ate on the porch, boots braced against the cold boards, the sky brightening by slow degrees. "You ever ride?" he asked, voice low, eyes still on the horizon. The question startled me, dragging memory sharp as bone. "Once," I said. "Years back." He nodded, as if that explained enough. "You'll ride again," he said. Not a question, not an offer, just a quiet truth laid on the table. I wanted to believe it. Later that day, he brought out a saddle, worn smooth by years of use. The leather cracked in places, but polished at the edges from countless hands. He showed me how to cinch the girth, how to check the bit. His hands moved slow, deliberate, never brushing mine unless necessary. The mare he offered me was smaller, dun-colored with a kind eye. My heart stuttered at the thought of swinging into a saddle again, ribs aching at the memory of falling, being dragged, being struck. He didn't push. Just waited, hand on the mare's shoulder, eyes calm as dusk. After a long breath, I placed my palm against the mare's neck, felt the warmth beneath her winter coat, the slow thump of her heart. My own heartbeat steadied in answer. "She won't spook easy," Ransom said, "but she'll feel your fear if you hold it too tight." That was the trick, wasn't it? Holding fear loose enough not to let it rule you, but tight enough not to forget. I mounted slow, every movement careful, ribs pulling tight with pain. The saddle creaked under my weight, leather cold through my borrowed coat. He mounted beside me, his horse a gelding with a scar over one eye. "We'll go slow," he said, and for the first time, I realized he didn't say it for the horse. He said it for me. We rode into the fields, the sun climbing higher, the frost turning to dew. Each step of the mare felt like testing an old wound, and finding it didn't hurt as much as memory warned. The wind smelled of sage and thawing earth. My hair, still tangled, lifted in the breeze. For a moment, I let myself breathe without thinking of where to run next. At a shallow creek, violets had begun to bloom where the snowmelt kissed the mud. I dismounted, legs shaking, boots sinking into soft earth. He stayed back, letting me kneel beside the flowers alone. Their petals were thin as breath, brave enough to bloom in cold. My fingers hovered above them, not daring to touch. Behind me, the horses stamped, tails flicking flies that weren't there yet. Ransom spoke then, voice lower than the creek's murmur. "They come early every spring." "Why here?" I asked. "Some places hold warmth longer," he said. I didn't answer, but I thought maybe people could too. It's strange how fast a place can start to feel like it remembers you. Even stranger when you've spent so long believing nowhere could. Days slipped into a rhythm. Not routine. Routine felt too stiff, too much like a cage, but something softer. A dance between two people who knew better than to step too close, yet kept circling back to each other all the same. Morning began with frost burning off the grass in pale smoke. I'd step outside, boots too big on my feet, coat wrapped tight around ribs still bruised but healing. Ransom would already be there, splitting wood or patching fence rails, the steam of his breath rising like prayer. He never spoke first, but somehow his silence invited words instead of swallowing them. I found myself speaking more. Small things at first, weather, chores, the stubborn hen that refused to roost anywhere but the porch rail. My voice rasped from disuse, but it felt good to let it out, even broken. He listened the same way he did everything, steady, eyes watchful but never prying, like the simple fact of my words mattered more than what they were. Evenings were quieter still. The hearth burned low, throwing amber light that softened the edges of the world. Ransom would sketch in the rocker, pencil scratching across paper slow and patient. I'd sit close enough to see the lines take shape. Sometimes a horse's bowed head, sometimes the crooked ridge behind the cabin. Once my own face, half turned, as though caught by accident. I didn't ask for these drawings. He didn't offer them. But their existence felt like proof of something I couldn't yet name. One night, my gaze caught on an old saddle propped near the hearth. Leather cracked, worn smooth in places, stitching coming loose at the cantle. "Yours?" I asked. "My father's," he said. His voice didn't catch, but something in it dulled. I traced the worn leather with careful fingers, feeling the ghost of a story there. What happened to him? Ransom didn't look away from the fire. "War," he said. Just the word. Nothing more. I didn't ask which war, or whose side. In towns like this, wars never really ended anyway. They just changed shape. The saddle smelled of old sweat and sun and miles traveled, of memory too heavy to carry, yet too dear to set down. The first real thaw came late. Snow lingered stubborn in the shadows, but the creek ran free again, its voice growing bolder each day. I worked beside him mending fence posts, hands raw from splinters. The pain felt different than bruises given by another. It felt earned, almost honest. When we paused to drink, he offered his canteen. Our hands brushed, and this time I didn't flinch. He noticed, not with a smile, but with a softening around the eyes that said enough. At night, sleep came easier, though not without ghosts. I still woke sometimes, heart pounding, breath caught in my throat. But now, when I did, I'd find the faint glow of embers in the hearth, and his shadow nearby. Not hovering, just there. Once, after a worse dream than usual, I rose and stepped to the doorway, moonlight silvering the yard. Ransom was on the porch, elbows on his knees, hat tipped low. He didn't turn when I joined him, but I felt him shift, making room. I sat, the boards cold under my legs, breath misting in the night air. For a while, we watched the stars in silence. The world felt big out there, yet strangely less frightening than the small spaces where cruelty hid. "You ever think about leaving?" I asked finally, voice hushed. His gaze stayed on the horizon. "Used to," he said. "But a man can run out of places to run." I nodded. I knew that truth bone deep. "And you?" he asked after a long moment. "I used to think leaving was the only way to live," I whispered. "Now, I don't know." He didn't press. Just let my words hang between us like mist that would burn off in its own time. We rose before dawn to ride the fence line. The sky bled from black to pewter, then to bruised purple. The cold bit hard, but my body moved easier now, pain fading to a dull memory. Ransom rode ahead, hat brim casting his face in shadow, but his posture spoke trust. Back straight, shoulders loose, reins held light. I watched how he scanned the hills, not with fear, but with an animal sense of belonging. There was quiet strength in that, living in a place not because it was safe, but because it was yours to defend. We didn't speak much on those rides. The land spoke enough, the creek murmuring secrets, wind combing through dry grass, a hawk's cry echoing against the ridge. For the first time in years, I realized silence didn't have to be emptiness. It could be shared. One evening, as dusk painted the cabin walls in gold and rust, I found Ransom at the table, pencil paused over a blank page. He looked up, hesitated, then slid the page toward me. "Draw something," he said, voice gentler than I'd ever heard it. My heart lurched. "I don't know how." "Doesn't matter," he said. "Draw anyway." My hand shook as I took the pencil. The page felt too white, too expectant. But slowly, clumsily, I sketched the violets by the creek. Petals crooked, lines wobbly, but honest in their imperfection. When I finished, I didn't look at him, afraid of what I'd see. But he didn't laugh, didn't correct me. "They're good," he said, simple as breath. And somehow, I believed him. That night, by the fire, I whispered my name aloud for the first time since leaving the town that tried to break me. "Unia," I said, the sound catching in my throat like something fragile. Ransom didn't repeat it, just let it settle in the room, as though speaking it made it real again. For the first time in so long I could barely remember, I felt like someone, not something. There's a kind of quiet that doesn't come from silence alone, but from trust earned slow as moss growing on stone. Days spilled into each other like water, each one softer than the last. I began to know the shape of the land, where the creek curled behind the hill, where violets dared to bloom first, where the deer crossed at dawn. The cabin itself felt different now. At first, it had seemed only shelter, a roof, walls, a place to hide bones too tired to keep moving. But little by little, it became something warmer. Not quite home yet, but a promise of what home could mean. Ransom never spoke much about himself. But in the hush between chores and supper, pieces slipped out. Once, as we sat on the porch, I asked why he stayed in a place most would flee. Because running didn't change what chased me, he said. His voice was low, not sad, just honest. Another time, I caught him looking at the ridge where trees stood black against dusk. His gaze distant, mouth drawn in a line that knew loss. "You miss someone," I said. He didn't deny it. Just nodded once. I didn't press. Some names hurt more when spoken aloud. The land itself taught me patience. Fence posts don't mend quick. Animals don't rush trust. And scars, whether in flesh or heart, heal slower than you ever want them to. My hands remembered old calluses, palms toughening from axe handle and bucket rope. Some mornings, I'd catch sight of my reflection in the water trough, still bruised but less hollow-eyed. I wore his coat less often now. The wind still bit, but I found my own warmth growing back. One morning, frost lay thin on the grass, the sun pale as a half-remembered dream. Ransom led me to the barn, where a new foal trembled beside its mother. Its legs were too long, movements awkward, eyes wide and blinking at a world too big. "You can touch him," he said. I hesitated, fear old as my own bones. But slowly, hand outstretched, I let my palm brush the foal's damp shoulder. Warmth bloomed under my skin, startling in its softness. The foal leaned into me, a creature too new to know fear. For a moment, I forgot every bruise, every night I'd curled tight against fists and laughter. Life could begin again, even in cold places. We settled into an unspoken rhythm. I'd cook some nights, simple stews, flatbread baked on stones near the hearth. Other nights, he'd slice salted meat, brew weak tea that tasted better than it had any right to. We still spoke little, but words began to come easier. Small truths, shared like bread broken between us. "I used to sing," I admitted once, voice rough with disuse. "What stopped you?" "No one listened," I said. Then softer, "Or they listened wrong." He nodded, as if that made sense. One evening, rain came sudden and hard, drumming on the roof like fists. Thunder rolled over the hills, close enough to shake dust from the rafters. I flinched at each crack, breath caught tight in my chest. Ransom noticed, didn't speak, just moved his chair closer to mine, not touching, but near enough to share the space. The thunder still came, but it felt different, less like threat, more like sound passing over. When the worst of the storm eased, I found my hand had drifted to the back of his chair. Fingers curled there, resting in the groove worn smooth by years. He didn't move away. In the mornings, we rode out to check the far field. The mare no longer felt like borrowed muscle under me, but something closer to partnership. Ransom rode beside, posture easy, eyes always on the horizon. Sometimes, when the wind shifted, I'd catch a whiff of cedar smoke and leather, the scent of him familiar now. Safe. One night, by the dying fire, I dared to ask, "Are you waiting for me to leave?" His pencil paused mid-sketch. "No," he said quietly, "but I won't stop you if you do." The honesty of it cut deeper than any plea to stay would have. I realized then, trust wasn't what someone asked of you, it was what they gave without demand. The past still clung. Memories rose sharp as thorns, alley stones slick with blood, laughter turning to snarls, the cold taste of fear. But now, when they came, they didn't choke me silent. I'd wake sweating, heart racing, and see the glow of embers, the shape of him near the hearth. Not guarding me, exactly, but being there. Some nights I'd whisper ransom, just to be sure he was real. He'd answer with nothing but a slow, steady breath. And that was enough. The violets near the creek bloomed fuller this year. I found myself kneeling among them often, fingers brushing petals too fragile to survive hard hands, yet somehow they did. Once, I caught him watching me there. His gaze steady, not possessive. Seeing, not claiming. For the first time in years, being seen didn't feel like danger. It felt like belonging. One evening, as dusk painted gold over the valley, I caught my reflection in the cabin window. Scars still marked my face, old and new. But beneath them, something else had returned, an almost forgotten spark. Not yet healed, not yet whole, but alive. And maybe, just maybe, strong enough to keep living. The world outside the cabin's fragile peace never forgot. No matter how far the hills stretched or how soft the firelight flickered, the shadows of the past waited beyond the trees, patient and cold. One morning, I awoke to a silence heavier than usual. The wind held its breath, and even the creek murmured low, as if warning me before I saw him. Low. His silhouette dark against the sky, standing at the edge of the clearing where the cabin's light faded into the wilderness. I swallowed the sudden rush of old fear, the kind that grips your throat and steals your breath. I hadn't seen him since that night at the door, but his presence was a sharp reminder that some wounds never truly close. Ransom was already outside when I stepped out, axe in hand, eyes sharp like the edge of the blade. Low's voice carried over the chill morning air, rough and mocking. Words I refused to hear, promises wrapped in threats. But Ransom didn't falter. Not once. He faced Low with a stillness that made the ground seem steadier beneath my feet. I watched as the two men sized each other up, not just for strength, but for something unspoken. A line drawn not in dirt, but in the quiet resolve of those who refuse to be broken again. Low sneered and spat into the snow before turning away, the threat hanging like smoke behind him. That day, the woods felt colder, the sky more grey. I sat by the fire, hands trembling not from cold, but from the echo of old nightmares waking up. Ransom didn't press for words. He never did. But later, when the night grew still, I caught him staring at me with something I couldn't name, something softer than anger, deeper than protection. For the first time, I let myself ask a question I'd buried beneath scars and silence. What if they come back? His answer was steady, like the rhythm of the fire. Then we face it. Together. The days that followed blurred between chores and watchful glances at the horizon. I learned the weight of silence isn't always absence. It can be a shield. But beneath it, a quiet courage grew in me. Something fierce and unwilling to be hidden any longer. One afternoon, while mending the fence, I caught Ransom watching me with a look that didn't waver. "You're stronger than you know," he said, voice low. I wanted to believe him. Night after night, the past clawed at my dreams, faces, voices, pain I thought buried deep. But in the quiet of the cabin, with the steady warmth of the fire and the soft scrape of pencil on paper, I found something else. Hope. Hope wasn't loud or bright. It was the small moments, the touch of a hand that didn't hurt, the taste of stew shared without strings, the sound of a name spoken with care. One evening, as the stars blinked awake, I sat beside Ransom on the porch. The air smelled of pine and smoke, the world hushed as if waiting. I reached out, fingers brushing his knuckles. He didn't pull away. And in that simple gesture, something shifted, an unspoken promise made in the quiet between us. The road ahead was still uncertain. But for the first time in years, I felt like I wasn't walking it alone. The days grew shorter, the shadows longer, as autumn crept over the valley like a slow breath. The cabin stood quiet, nestled in the trees, but even in its stillness, the weight of the world pressed close. I learned quickly that peace was fragile, not because it was weak, but because it was precious, and worth fighting for. Ransom and I fell into a rhythm that felt like survival and grace all at once. Mornings brought chores beneath pale skies, splitting wood, hauling water, patching fences that creaked with age. Evenings found us by the fire's glow, the warmth wrapping around bruises still tender in body and spirit. The quiet between us was no longer empty. It hummed with understanding. I saw it in the way he watched the land, steady, watchful, like every tree and rock was part of a story he carried deep inside, and in the way he listened when I spoke, no longer with fear, but with a voice that sought to be heard. But the past never forgot me. One afternoon, the stillness shattered. A rider came, a stranger with hard eyes and the kind of smile that didn't reach them. He asked questions I didn't want to answer. His words were polite but sharp, like the blade of a knife hidden beneath silk. Ransom met the man with calm that didn't waver, but I could feel the tension in the air, thick as smoke. The rider's gaze lingered on me longer than necessary, and a cold shiver traced my spine. That night, sleep was a stranger. Dreams twisted into nightmares I thought I'd buried, fists and voices, laughter turning to screams. I woke gasping, heart pounding, and found Ransom beside me, eyes open and steady in the dark. Without words, he reached out, fingers brushing my hair. That touch was a lifeline, soft, sure, unyielding. The next day, I found myself at the edge of the creek, fingers trailing through cold water that whispered secrets of time and healing. Ransom joined me, standing close but not crowding. "You carry a lot," he said quietly. I swallowed, trying to hold back a flood of memories. "So do you," I whispered. For a moment, silence held us together, two wounded souls balanced on the edge of something new. The rider returned once more, his visits growing frequent and unwelcome. One afternoon, as shadows stretched long, he brought men with him. They came with threats thinly veiled in smiles, eyes sharp with greed and cruelty. But Ransom stood firm. His voice was calm, but every word carried weight like the crack of a rifle shot. He made it clear, this place, and the woman who found shelter here, were under his protection. The men left, but the warning lingered like a chill wind through the trees. I realized then that safety wasn't given, it was claimed, not with fists or fury, but with quiet, unbreakable resolve. Ransom's scarred jaw set tight as he stood watch at night, his eyes never letting the dark swallow what he guarded. And I, who had once thought myself broken beyond repair, found strength in standing beside him. One evening, beneath a sky brushed with stars, I dared to break the silence between us. "Do you ever wish for something different?" His answer came slow, thoughtful. "Every day," he said. "But sometimes, what we have is more than enough to fight for." That night, the fire burned brighter, casting flickering shadows that danced like hope. The seasons turned, leaves falling in a slow, golden rain. I learned to ride not just horses, but the currents of my own heart, steady, cautious, yet open to the possibility of healing. Ransom and I were no longer just two wounded souls coexisting in silence. We were a promise, a fragile, fierce promise that even in the cruelest places, kindness could take root. As winter whispered its approach, I knew the hardest battles were still ahead. But for the first time I felt ready, not because the past was gone, but because I no longer faced it alone. The nights had grown longer, heavier, as winter's breath began to seep into the valley. The creek froze in places, thin sheets of ice cracking underfoot, and the pines stood bare and shivering beneath grey skies. But inside the cabin, the fire never wavered. I could feel the change in the air, the quiet before a storm, the kind that settled in your bones before the first thunderclap. Ransom was as steady as ever, though even his eyes held a flicker of concern that I hadn't seen before. His calm was a fortress, but I wondered how long the walls could hold. The rider, the man with cold eyes and a hunger for control, had not forgotten us. His visits grew more frequent, his tone sharper, his threats heavier. One evening I watched him from the window, his silhouette dark against the fading sun, as he spoke to the men who followed him like wolves circling prey. I felt the old fear stir, raw and wild, but Ransom's presence was my anchor. When I turned to him, his gaze was calm, unyielding. "They want to scare you," he said quietly, "but fear only wins if you let it." His words were a lifeline, pulling me back from the edge of my own memories. Days later, the rider returned with more men. They came under the guise of parley, but their eyes held promises of violence. Ransom met them at the cabin's edge, his silhouette firm beneath the grey sky. I stood behind the door, heart pounding as I listened to the harsh whispers and low threats exchanged. Then, the crack of Ransom's voice, steady and cold, cutting through the tension. "This land is no place for bullies. Leave, or face what comes." The men sneered, spat on the ground, but the weight behind Ransom's words was clear. They left, but the threat lingered, a shadow darkening the edge of our fragile peace. That night, sleep fled me. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, feeling the ache of every bruise, every scar. But alongside the pain was something new, a flicker of resolve. I was no longer the broken girl dragged through alleys and silenced by cruelty. I was a woman who had tasted safety, who had found kindness in a world that offered none, and I was ready to fight for it. Morning brought frost and silence. I found Ransom by the fire, sketching quietly, his hands steady despite the cold. I sat beside him, voice barely above a whisper. "What if they come back?" He looked up, eyes shadowed but fierce. "Then we stand together, and we don't fall." His promise settled in my bones like a shield. The days that followed were filled with preparations. We fortified the cabin, stacking wood, sharpening tools, readying ourselves for the storm we knew was coming. The valley was quiet but charged, every gust of wind carrying the weight of what might come. One night, as the wind howled outside, I found myself beside Ransom on the porch, watching the stars flicker through the branches. My voice trembled as I spoke. "I'm scared." He didn't laugh or turn away. Instead, he reached out, taking my hand in his warm, steady, unshakable. "Good," he said softly, "because courage isn't the absence of fear. It's standing strong despite it." And for the first time, I believed it. Winter descended fully, wrapping the valley in a white shroud. We moved through the days with quiet determination, healing, preparing, living. Our bond grew, not just as survivors, but as something stronger, something unbreakable. Then, the night came, the one we'd been bracing for. Shouts pierced the cold air, boots pounding through snow, men with cruel eyes and darker intentions. But Ransom was ready, and so was I. Together, we faced the storm, not with fists raised in fury, but with steady hearts and unyielding strength. Because sometimes, the greatest power lies not in violence, but in the courage to stand, side by side, unbroken. The night we feared came like a storm breaking loose. Snow fell hard and fast, a white curtain blurring the world, swallowing sound and light alike. But beneath that quiet fury, something darker approached. Footsteps heavy and sure, echoing across frozen ground. The men. Their silhouettes moved like shadows against the swirling snow, cruel, unrelenting, bent on destruction. I stood at the cabin's threshold, coat wrapped tight, heart pounding so loud I thought it might give me away. Ransom was beside me, eyes cold and steady, a scarred guardian shaped by years of battles both fought and endured. He didn't speak. He never did when danger came close. But his presence said everything. We would not break. The front man, the rider with cold eyes and a snake smile, stepped forward, voice raised over the wind. "You think you can hide here? You think this place belongs to you?" Ransom's reply was low, each word measured and heavy. "This land belongs to those who protect it. Leave now, or you'll find there's more strength here than you imagined." The men laughed, but there was an edge to their mirth, a crack in their confidence. We had not been the easy prey they'd expected. The first blow came swift. A shout, the crash of wood, and then the world tipped into chaos. I ducked, heart in my throat, as shadows collided beneath the porch light. Ransom moved like a storm unleashed, fierce and precise. His hands were weapons, but more than that, they were shields. I saw him protect, not strike. Every movement spoke of control born from pain. The fight was brutal but brief. The men weren't prepared for resistance, especially not from a scarred man who didn't rely on rage but on purpose. One by one, they fell back, driven off by a fury they couldn't understand. When the last retreating footstep faded, silence reclaimed the night. I collapsed against the cabin wall, breath ragged but alive. Ransom came to me then, his hand gentle as he brushed snow from my hair. "You're safe," he said. I wanted to believe it, wanted to feel the truth of those words deep inside. But safety, I realized, was a fragile thing, a whisper in the wind, not a promise etched in stone. I looked at Ransom then, really looked, and saw the weight he carried. The years of battles fought alone. The scars he wore like armor. And I knew I was not the only one broken. That night, we sat by the fire, the world outside frozen and still. Our silence was no longer empty. It held a quiet understanding. I traced the lines of his scar, wondering what stories it held, what truths lay hidden beneath. He didn't speak of them, but I felt their presence. Heavy, unyielding. For the first time, I let my guard down. Tears slipped free, not the quiet, choking kind I'd known before, but something raw and real. I cried for the pain buried too deep, for the years lost to silence, for the hope I thought I'd never find. Ransom reached out, pulling me close, not with desperation, but with steady strength. We held each other through the long night, two wounded souls learning to heal. The dawn came soft, washing away the cold. Outside, the world was quiet, new, fragile. I knew the road ahead would still be hard. There would be days of doubt and fear. But we had faced the storm together, and in that, there was power. I stood by the window, watching the snow melt into the earth. Ransom's voice came behind me, quiet but certain. "You don't owe me anything." I turned to him, eyes bright with something close to hope. "Maybe," I said, "but I want to give you everything." He smiled then, the first real smile I'd seen from him, a promise and a beginning. We were no longer just survivors. We were something more, a bond forged in silence, tested in fire, and tempered in kindness. And as the valley stirred awake beneath a warming sun, I knew, for the first time, I was ready to live. The morning sun filtered softly through the frost-kissed windows, painting the cabin's worn wooden walls with golden light. It was a quiet kind of peace, not the naive silence of forgetting, but the hard-won stillness of survival and hope. I stood by the hearth, feeling the warmth seep into my bones as the last remnants of winter clung stubbornly to the valley outside. The air smelled of cedar smoke and the faint sweetness of simmering stew. Ordinary things, simple things, but treasures to someone who had once known only cold and cruelty. Ransom was outside, splitting wood with his steady rhythm, the axe rising and falling like a heartbeat that matched the land itself. I watched him from the window, tracing the lines of his scarred jaw, the way his sleeves were rolled back to reveal hands calloused by work and tempered by time. For so long, I had seen those hands only as weapons, as instruments of defense or violence. But now, they were something else. Hands that could build, that could protect, that could offer kindness without expectation or weakness. The memories that haunted me still lingered, the shadows of that merciless town, the dark alleys, the cruel men who had marked my body and soul. But they no longer defined me. They were chapters in a story that had been rewritten, not erased, but transformed. The weight of silence had lifted between us, not because we spoke endlessly, but because in the quiet, we found each other. I remembered the first time I saw Ransom holding out that tin cup, steam rising like a prayer into the cold air. The strange comfort of warm broth, the heavy coat laid gently beside me, gestures that spoke louder than words. That moment had been the first crack in my armor, the fragile beginning of a trust one had never thought possible. I moved to the door, stepping outside into the crisp morning. The snow crunched softly beneath my boots, the new boots Ransom had given me, too large but sturdy. I pulled the coat tighter around me, the leather worn smooth and soft against my skin. He looked up as I approached, eyes steady and calm, a silent question waiting there. I smiled, a real smile, free of fear and doubt. "I'm ready," I said simply. He nodded, as if those two words carried the weight of 1,000 unspoken promises. Together we walked toward the ridge where the valley stretched wide, the sky a vast canvas of blue and gold. The wind whispered through the trees, carrying the scent of pine and earth, and something else, something like freedom. I mounted my horse, feeling the familiar weight of the saddle beneath me, the steady breath of the mare beneath my legs. Ransom settled beside me, his horse moving with quiet strength. We rode side by side, not as broken souls seeking refuge, but as two people who had found something worth holding on to. Not perfect, not unscarred, but real. The past would always be a part of us, like the scar on Ransom's jaw or the bruises fading from my skin. But it was no longer a chain that bound us. It was a reminder of what we had survived, a testament to the strength born from pain and the healing found in kindness. Days turned into weeks. The cabin grew warmer with laughter and light. I learned to trust the silence, the kind that speaks of safety rather than fear. I learned that healing was not a destination, but a journey walked step by step, with someone who would stand beside you when the road was rough. Ransom taught me that strength was not measured in fists or scars, but in the courage to be gentle in a world that demanded hardness. And I taught myself that I was more than the wounds I carried. One evening, beneath a sky alive with stars, we sat by the fire once more. The world outside was quiet, wrapped in the deep breath of night. Ransom's hand found mine, steady, sure. I looked up at him, eyes clear for the first time in years. "Thank you," I whispered. He smiled, a soft, real smile that reached his eyes. "No," he said, "thank you for letting me be part of your story." That night, I slept not curled in fear, but stretched out in peace. The fire burned low, a gentle rhythm keeping watch. And as sleep claimed me, I dreamed not of fists or fear, but of horses running wild across endless fields, of violets blooming near a creek, of a life reclaimed. The dawn came soft and bright. The valley stirred awake, a world renewed. And I was ready. For the first time in a long time, I was free. This was not just an ending. It was the beginning. If you were in her shoes, would you fight the same battle? Share your thoughts in the comments below, And don't forget to like the video. Explore the other videos on your screen. There's more stories waiting for you.